When we talk about Torah and other people talk about the Bible, we are talking about two different things.
Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Aaron Sokol, and you're watching Parsha Inspired. My guest today is Rabbi Mordechai Becher. Rabbi Becher, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
The Jews received the Torah at Har Sinai. The three world major religions accept that. So my question is why is it that the Jews have volumes upon volumes of Talmud and all different laws, which, if you asked me, the plain text doesn't seem to say it?
When we talk about Torah and other people talk about the Bible, we are talking about two different things. The Bible is basically the literal text of the 5 books of Moses and the 24 books of the prophets and writings. That literal text. But when we as Jews talk about Torah, we mean much more than that. What you see of the Torah in the Bible is the tip of the iceberg, of Judaism. And really, Judaism is heavily based on an idea that the Bible, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, is not a standalone text. It is accompanied by a vast tradition going back to Sinai that elucidates, explains, applies, and gives us the ability to read and to understand the text. I mean, think of this. You're looking at a text which is over 3,000 years old. Even according to the most extreme Bible critics, it's at least 2,000 years old. Now, if you read, we both speak English, we both read English, but if you pick up a book written like Beowulf or Chaucer, 600 years ago, 700 years ago, 800 years ago, it's very difficult to understand, almost impossible. And when they refer to foods, objects, practices, even if you could read it, it's very hard to know what these things are. Biblical Archaeology Review, it's a magazine, comes out 4 times a year. So every edition, they have a little picture early on in the magazine of an artifact. And it says, what is this? And it gives you like 4 options. Is this an Assyrian idol? Is this a Babylonian torture device? Is this an Egyptian cosmetic? Whatever, you know what I mean? Crazy stuff. And it's very difficult to know. You go to page 58. You go to page 58, right? And it tells you what it is. Now, you and I know that when the Torah speaks about artifacts, like put a sign upon your arm and a frontlet between your eyes, no idea. Right. From that description, you wouldn't know what it is. Okay. So when the Torah tells me don't work on Shabbat, I don't know how to define work. Is work force times displacement? This is work from a physics perspective. I just did work, right? I don't know if I work in a think tank. This is work, right? So, and not only that, but just to read the Torah, Hebrew doesn't have vowels. It's just consonants. I mean, a couple of vowels, aleph and ayin. But to read the Hebrew words requires you to hear someone read it to know what it means. You could have a word, chet lamed beit. It could mean fat, chalev. It could mean milk, chalav. It could mean milking, chalev. You could have a word, yud resh aleph hey. That could mean fear, yira. It could mean he will see, yireh. It could mean yera'eh, he will be seen. It could be read as yorah, he will show. These are major differences. So to read a text written thousands of years ago, you really do need some type of continuous living tradition, a language in which you can talk about it. Not only that, but there's no punctuation in the text of the Torah. So punctuation is important for giving emotion, for giving pauses, for, to read something as no swimming allowed as opposed to no swimming allowed, right, are significant differences. And so when we think of the oral law, we see it as the living the living mechanism by which the biblical text can be read, can be understood, can be applied, and so on and so forth. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch gives a beautiful analogy to explain the relationship between the text of the Torah, the Bible, and the oral law. He says, you go to a lecture on some subject, some esoteric scientific subject. You will no doubt have shorthand that you use. You won't write fully sodium chloride, you'll write NaCl. You won't write equilibrium, you'll use a little arrow of some sort. This shorthand is something used by experts in that area to take notes during the lecture. So in addition, you've heard the lecture, but he says, if you take those notes that you wrote in shorthand after hearing this lecture, and you give it to someone who didn't hear the lecture and doesn't know the shorthand, they'll look at the notes and they'll say, you've been drinking the chemicals? Because this doesn't make any sense, my friend. So he says, I'll just read you what he says. The written Torah is to the oral Torah short notes on a full and extensive lecture on a scientific subject. For the student who has heard the whole lecture, meaning the Jews in antiquity, short notes are sufficient to bring back afresh to his mind at any time the whole lecture. For him, a word, a mark, a hint is often quite sufficient to recall to his mind a whole series of thoughts. For those who have not heard the lecture from the master, the notes will be completely useless. So the Jewish people, we've heard the lecture and we've lived that lecture. So for us, we open up this text and we look at the short notes. We know what it means. The Torah tells us, on the 10th day of the 7th month, afflict your soul. We know, the 7th month coming up soon is Tishrei. On the 10th of that month is Yom Kippur. Afflict your soul means fasting, amongst other things, right? We know that. That's type of obvious to us, and it's always been obvious to us. When someone tells me, put a sign upon your arm and frontlets between your eyes, we know it's tefillin, and Jews in Qumran, back at the Qumran sect who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have tefillin from Qumran. They're square leather boxes with parchments inside. They're not black anymore. They've been around for 2,200 years. But they knew what it meant. When the Torah says, write on the doorposts of your home these words, so yeah, you can go back thousands of years. You can find mezuzot, go to Jewish communities around the world, right? People are not putting graffiti on their doors. What they've got is a scroll with Shema in it on their door. It's called a mezuzah. So it's a living Torah, and that's what the oral law is. So the written law are the short notes, condensed notes, and by the way, the Mechilta, it's an old rabbinic commentary on the Torah. The Mechilta tells us that it's interesting. It talks about, God could have punished the Jewish people after the sin of the spies in many different ways. He chose to have us wander in the desert for 40 years. And there's different views as to what the idea and the meaning of that is. The Mechilta says, you know why God did that? Because he wanted the Jews to absorb the oral law into their very bones. So to have an entire generation, have the best teachers on the planet, Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Miriam and the elders and so on, that have no worries about income. They've got the manna dropping out of the heaven. Their clothes are all dry clean. They climate control, etc. It is the ultimate educational seminar. Right? Shmorg, tea room open 24/7, great lectures the whole time. And that's what they're doing. So that by the time they came into Israel, which the book of Joshua describes that entry, they're a generation that already absorbed a lot of these ideas. And for them, it was understood, and they were able to transmit that throughout the generations. So I would say that is why the Jewish people have a Torah. To read the Torah, we need an oral tradition. To get the emphasis, emotion, and pauses, and so on, and the punctuation, we need an oral tradition. You need to hear the Torah. And by the way, when we hear the Torah being read in synagogue, it's not read, it's sung. The singing is part of the oral tradition as well, because when you sing something, that's when you give it the emotion and the punctuation. We have legal definitions, right? We understand, right? Work. What does work mean? What do we not do on the Sabbath? We understand the idea of Yom Kippur, right? And so on and so forth. And, it is hinted at in the actual text of the Torah, this idea. Those who are doing Daf Yomi will be familiar with this in Chulin. Of course, it's a while back, a couple of months, I think. But the Talmud quotes a verse in Deuteronomy, Devarim 12, where the verse says, V'zavachta, you shall slaughter, mibkarcha umitzoncha from your flocks and cattle that the Lord your God has given you, ka'asher tziviticha, as I have commanded you. So the Talmud already points out, nowhere does the Torah command us how to slaughter. The Torah is saying, V'zavachta, you shall slaughter of your cattle and your flocks, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Where did he command us this? If you look through the 5 books of Moses, there is no instructions how to slaughter an animal. None. And it says this is an allusion to hint to the idea that there's an oral Torah. Now, but there's another, so aside from the necessity of an oral Torah, it's not just a matter of necessity, there's actual advantages to it. There's advantages to it. What do I mean by the advantages? Well, you see, when there are certain things, first of all, in any system of education, you can't really write down. I'll give you an example. And I've done this survey in all over the world, probably about 20 countries, for thousands of people. I have asked in the audience, anyone who knows how to swim, please raise your hand. Everyone puts up. Most people put up their hand. Please put down your hands. Anyone who learned how to swim from a book, please put up your hand. No one puts up their hand. Why? Because people who learn how to swim from a book are tragically no longer with us. In other words, there are certain physical skills like how to live, how to be a decent human being. You've got to learn these from a human being. People go to medical school and they're studying college for many years. But an important part of the study of medicine is the person teaching it. The interaction with a senior medical staff who has been doing medicine for years, to do rounds in the hospital, to do residency, to learn from people who've been diagnosing and treating patients for years. That's an important part of it. In the study of law, you spend internship at a law firm. The same is true in many areas, right? It's not enough just to have 4 years college education. I mean, I could buy the texts. I could go to Amazon and buy the texts that are used in medical school and read them, memorize them. That would not make me a good physician. I think I need the oral tradition, so to speak. Tying my shoelace, I did not learn from a set of instructions. I would still be wearing Velcro if that was the case, right? Someone showed me how to do it. So that's number one. Number two, it's also a security mechanism. We've been thrown out of many countries. Our books have been burnt. So as long as we have with us this compact text, the 5 books of Moses, and we have the rules by which we can derive things, plus the understanding that the oral tradition, meaning the living language that God gave us, then it's very portable, very compact, very transportable, because a lot of it is in here and in here. And also, it's not as open to distortion. You see, what happened to our 5 books of Moses and the Tanakh? It got plagiarized. Entire religions were made out of mistranslation of texts, taking certain verses out of context, etc., etc. that didn't happen to the oral law for the simple reason that it wasn't as accessible to others as the written law. Something which is written down is too accessible, not secure. You want to have something secure, keep it in your mind. Don't email it, don't text it. I just did our mandatory security. We have these security courses at Yeshiva University. You have to take one every month on different parts of how to information and against phishing and et cetera, et cetera. So we just had one on keeping information safe. You know what I mean? So don't text, don't WhatsApp it. Use the internal communication tools we have, et cetera, et cetera. So the same is true of the oral law. The fact that it was oral meant that it was less accessible to the outside world, which means it was less likely to be plagiarized and distorted. Now, eventually it got written down because it had to, because it was in danger of loss and so on. But for many years, it was oral. So that's an important part of it. And I think one of the most important components is that it necessitates study. If everything's written in a book, in order to preserve it, all you need is a climate-controlled library and a feather duster. To preserve an oral tradition, you know what you need to do? Study, teach, review, go to an older person, speak to your grandparents, speak to your parents, discuss it. It has created an amazing and beautiful study ethic amongst the Jewish people. Extraordinary. Jews, as we know, have excelled and do excel in academia, in many areas of study, and a lot of that comes from this amazing ethic called Talmud Torah, Torah study. It has been drilled into the Jewish people for thousands of years. Study, study, learn, teach, review, study, learn, teach. Now, that was directed at Torah, and it has been now, in the past couple of hundred years, it's also been broadened to other areas. But this idea that the Torah encourages us to study is something so beautiful. And who studies in Judaism? Not just the priest, the imam, the guru, right? The rabbis. Everyone should be studying. It's a universal obligation. That's why literacy levels were so high amongst the Jews, even in medieval times where most people were illiterate. This is why, Jews were prized to work for kings and dukes and estate masters, because Jews were literate, Jews were educated. A lot of that comes from, I would say most of that comes from this study ethic. And the study ethic comes from the fact that the Torah was oral for so long. And even when it's written down, it still requires study, and it still requires teachers, and it still requires interaction between one person and another. That's why there's arguments in it, because different humans, we're invested in it, and everyone has their own perspective. And that's why we have in the Torah, we have resolution mechanisms for when there are arguments. Follow the majority, rabbinic laws, we are lenient, biblical laws, we are stringent in cases of doubt, and so on and so forth. But that's not a glitch in the system, arguments and individual opinions. That's actually a feature, because what it means is we're invested, we're involved. We're intimately involved in the Torah, and it's part of me. I'm part of it. You can't distinguish the great sage Hillel from his Torah. You can't separate Rosh Zalman of Liadi from his teachings, the Tanya. You can't separate Maimonides from his Mishnah Torah, from his Guide for the Perplexed. That's who they were. In very actually in traditional yeshiva world, we often call or refer to sages not by their names. In fact, a lot of yeshivas don't even know the names of some of the sages who wrote their books. They just know them by the name of the book. We refer to the Ktsois, one of the famous commentaries on the Code of Jewish Law financial part. You ask people, what was the name of the author? I don't know, right? He's called the Ktsois. That's who he was, his book, right? So, it's very, and I think that's very beautiful, because it means that the Jewish people have been so involved in it that we became identified with it. I heard from my teacher, Rabbi Mordechai Shapiro, a very beautiful idea. You look at the depiction of the tablets of the law throughout history, the luchos, in shuls around the world. They're always rounded at the top, almost always. I mean, vast majority of shuls rounded. Chabad is strict not to do that, but the vast majority of synagogues rounded tops. And art historians believe that goes back to the Renaissance, probably correct, where artists decided that to depict them as rectangular or square cubes would not distinguish enough between the two tablets. So they made it rounded. But Rabbi Shapiro asks, so he says, but we know that's not accurate. From the ark itself, the shape of the ark itself, the Talmud in Bava Batra, the Medrash Rabbah in many places, they describe the tablets of the law as cubes or square, rectangular prisms or cubes. Why did rabbis allow the artists to distort historical reality and to make them round? Why are rabbis okay with that? I don't know. Since when are rabbis so easygoing? Very rare. Except for me, obviously, but but why? So Rabbi Shapiro said, it's based on a verse in Proverbs. The verse in Proverbs says, "Katveim aluach libecha," write the words of Torah on the tablets of your heart. He said, the words of Torah are not only written on stone, they're written on the heart. He says the round shape is like an anatomical shape. Anatomical shapes are not square. They're round. It's supposed to depict the heart of the human being, the lave. Because when you look up at the tablets, you're supposed to realize the Torah is not only written on stone or on text, it's also written in the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. It's a beautiful idea. It goes back a little further than Rabbi Shapiro, but that's how he explained this idea. I would give one more slightly, it's not radical, but it sounds radical, but one more idea. The advantage of an oral tradition is flexibility. This is from the Midrash Shmuel, Shmuel de Ozida. I'm giving the introduction because it sounds radical, but Shmuel de Ozida wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot called Midrash Shmuel. Shmuel de Ozida lived in Tzfat in the 16th century. He was a colleague and friend of Reb Chaim Vital, a student of the Arizal, Reb Isaac Luria, and we have a tradition that the Arizal would stand up when Rosh Shmuel de Ozida would walk into the room. So just to give you a perspective, Rosh Shmuel de Ozida writes it's the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. He writes that, why it was not written down? He says, once something is written down, it becomes inflexible and concrete. He says, when it becomes inflexible and concrete, that's not a good thing, because there are generations where something that was once permitted needs to be prohibited. Something which was once prohibited needs to be permitted. We have to be either stricter or more lenient in something. He says, changing social realities. He says, we have a mechanism for that. It's called the Sanhedrin. We don't have that anymore. But we had for thousands of years a Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. And using the rules of the oral tradition, they were able to apply the Torah in any time, any place, any situation, all socioeconomic and geopolitical realities. And the Torah, they were able to apply it in a very real, living way. And he says having the Torah as completely inflexible, he says, is an avla, it's an iniquity. It's a problem. Now, for us nowadays, we do have a problem, which is that we don't have a Sanhedrin. So we are somewhat stuck. Of course, we believe that's divine providence. So that's what God wills. That's how it goes. But for a long time, we had a Sanhedrin that was able to, they were the pillars, as Maimonides called them, the pillars of the Torah, of the oral Torah. And the Torah was conducted through the way they did it. So and in the words of Rav Nata Shiller, Alav HaShalom, who was one of the great Rosh Yeshivas of Or Sameach, he quoted this idea, and he once put it this way, just very beautifully he had a he had a facility with language, which I've not heard anyone else come close. And Rav Schiller put it this way. He says, we change enough to stay the same. He says the flexibility is to change enough to stay the same. You know what I mean? If you can flex when you're pushed by something or someone, you can stand upright. If you don't flex, you'll fall. Okay. So it's a Tai Chi principle, right? So, but changing enough to stay the same. That's how he put it. And that's one of the other advantages of an oral tradition. So that's a second point.
So Yigal Yadin, when he excavated Masada, he not only found a mikveh there, he also found tefillin, as you said. And some of these tefillin actually were, for those of you who know, there are two versions of tefillin that relate to different orders of the chapters inside of it. And they found both versions. They found Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Now, in Deuteronomy, it says twice, we cannot add or subtract. I think it's in Deuteronomy 4:2 and in 13:1 in the Jewish Bible. I think in the Christian Bible it will be 13:2. So it says, do not add or subtract. So how is it that, let's say, Rabbi Akiva knew things that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know? I mean, isn't this entering a dangerous thing? Because, like, you know, we have different types of Jews today. Some of them are conservative, some are reform, and some say that, like, you know, times have changed, and we as a group have decided, let's just do away with what, if we need to drive to Shul on Shabbat, maybe that should be okay. I'm asking, this is a tough question, but I think this should be addressed. Thank you.
Okay, well, we don't want to conflate two issues here. Now, first of all, Yigal Yadin, I think it was not at Masada, but it was in Qumran.
Okay, fair enough.
And I'm not sure if both were found, but you have two issues. Number one is the issue of the oral tradition. There's a set, and how you could have arguments and disagreements within that. The other is the issue of rabbinic law and how they could actually legislate and create additions, so to speak, to the Torah. And the third is the question is how far that flexibility can go. So let's address one at a time. First of all, within the oral tradition, it is possible to have differences of opinion and interpretation, like Rashi and his grandson, his youngest grandson, Rabbeinu Yaakov, known as Rabbeinu Tam, who said, we know they both agreed on the shape of tefillin, they both agreed on the material, they both agreed on the obligation, they both agreed on what parchments are inside the tefillin, they both agreed that in the head tefillin that's 4 separate, on the arm tefillin that's 1, they both agree. It's the agreements are much more than the disagreements. But there's a disagreement in what's the order of the parashas. Is it as they appear in the Torah, in the order of they appear in the Torah, or is it appear, if you're looking at them, 2 to one side of the observer and 2 to the other side of the observer? And how do we place them in there? And that's not explicit in the oral tradition, which means there's room for different views about it. And the way we decide that is generally by consensus. And we had a consensus and still have, in accordance with the opinion of Rashi, which is what most people do. You know, the one of the commentaries, I believe it's the Prisha, I don't remember, maybe it's in the Tur, in the Laws of Tefillin, points out that they found in the tomb of the prophet Yechezkel, the dome collapsed and they're doing repair work on it. They found a pair of tefillin in the structure, buried there. So one of the commentaries says, and the pair of tefillin was in accordance with Rashi. He says, you see evidence for Rashi in that. The other said, what are you talking about? He says, the reason they buried it because it was not valid. So it doesn't, anyway. So, but be that as it may, there are areas within the oral law, and this is true in every area of human knowledge. When you're studying, there are major disputes in science, in medicine, in physics, in law, because the human being, every human sees things differently. Usually the differences between the way you and I see that table are not significant. The table in your mind, the table in my mind, and the table as it is in itself, as a German philosopher would put it, makes not much of a difference. So you just put it on the table over there, right? Unless you are a German philosopher, you will not say, you mean the table in my mind, the table as it is in your mind, or the table as it is in itself. We would say it's just on the stupid table, mate. Put it on the table. But when it comes to legal definitions, when it comes to things like that, they're going to be individual differences, and that's why the Torah gives us a way to adjudicate. Let me address the third question because it's relevant to that. When the Torah says that there could be disputes and we can resolve them, the Torah actually gives us the method of resolution. Deuteronomy 17, it says, when you have a matter which is beyond you, yipaleh mincha, something which you don't understand, between one blood and another blood, between litigation, arguments amongst people, wounds, blemishes, what do? You go to the priests, the Levites, and the judges in that place that the Lord your God has chosen. You'll get up and go to the place the Lord your God has chosen, which is a reference to Jerusalem, and you shall ask them what to do, and they shall adjudicate. So we have a methodology, the Sanhedrin. Go to the Sanhedrin. We don't have a Sanhedrin, so there's a limitation on the amount of flexibility we have. Now, the problem here is, and this is something which is, I think, important. We talk about reform, conservative, etc. When you have an argument within an area of knowledge, physics, medicine, and so on, there are parameters to the argument. Meaning, I cannot invoke, if legitimate debates in the halls of academia in physics, no one will be invoking Harry Potter as a source. We will not be describing gravity as gremlins dragging things down to their caves, right? There are going to be parameters, just like in physical athletic competition. Two fighters go into a kumite, right? Martial arts competition, right? And the referee goes, Hajime, begin, right? And one guy pulls out a Glock 9mm, blows the other guy away. I don't think he's going to get any points for. I mean, he's technically won the argument, but he has not done it within the rules, right? Within the Torah, there are rules, right? For example, if my Yom Kippur, my interpretation of Yom Kippur ends up being a day for barbecues, picnics, and discos, then that has gone outside the parameters of the Torah, because the Torah says, afflict your soul on the 10th day of the 7th month. So there's got to be some type of parameter. So if we have a debate about any, and that's why when there are debates within Jewish law, there's more agreement than debate. When electricity started being used on a regular basis by people 100 years ago, 200, 150 years ago, so there were debates about the nature of electricity on Shabbat. But those debates were, I look at them like a pyramid. Where the base of the pyramid is, I believe in the Torah. Second base, I believe in the Oral Torah. The sources we are using is the Mishnah in the 7th chapter of Shabbat, right? And we're going to try to define which one of the 39 Malachot laws does electricity fall under, if at all. So at the top of the pyramid, there's an argument between the Chazon Ish, Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, on the nature of electricity, but the agreement is vast. If I debate someone who has no parameters, I can't have a meaningful debate. I had a discussion with a Reform rabbi, and I was asking her. I mentioned this idea, and I said to her, "What are the red lines? What are the red lines? For me, the red lines are the text of the Torah, the opinions mentioned in the oral tradition. We don't go beyond that. There are 2 opinions in the Mishnah. I don't go to a third, fourth. I have certain red lines, and within that, there can be vigorous debate. But I've got certain red lines. What are your red lines? Obviously, I said, what about a verse in the Torah? If you believe that for sociological reasons, we have to now permit something which the Torah explicitly prohibits, are you okay with that? She said, yes. I said, okay. So what for you are the red lines? She says, I don't really know. what are the red lines? The ethics of the prophets is very nebulous. So if there's no red lines, you can't have a meaningful debate. Because I will bring a verse after verse in the Torah, statements in the Talmud, and so on, and they'll say that's very nice, but we feel differently. So that's a bit of a problem. That's not a bit of a problem. That's a major issue. Obviously, we don't have time to fully explore this, but that is going to be a major issue in these types. So for us, we need the methodology of the oral tradition, and we need the sources of the Torah as our that will limit the debate into these areas. And now, in terms of the second question, which is adding to the Torah, so there are a number of approaches. Let me just give you Maimonides, which I think is very, very clear and approach. We have in our house a rule: no food is to be taken up. We tell our grandchildren and our guests, you can't take food upstairs. Why? Raccoons and squirrels smell it and it attracts them. So no food upstairs. Have I added to the Torah? I know. My grandson says, why can't I take food upstairs? And I say, because the Torah says no food upstairs. Now I have added to the Torah. That's a problem. If I tell my grandson, I said, because Savta, grandma, doesn't want food upstairs because it attracts rodents, right? That is not adding to the Torah. So if the rabbis say, we know according to Torah law, it is only prohibited to cook meat from an animal that has mother's milk. That doesn't include chicken and turkey. But we're going to prohibit it because linguistically, it's also called meat and people will make a mistake and whatever reasons they had. If I ask my rabbi, can I have turkey and Swiss on rye? And the rabbi says, no, it's prohibited. And I ask him why. If he says, because the Torah says so, he's transgressed adding to the Torah. Maimonides says. But if he says, because the Sanhedrin decreed that it's prohibited, even though in the Torah it's permitted, he hasn't transgressed because he's made a clear distinction between rabbinic law and biblical law. And we know halachically in a legal way, they're also distinguished. We are lenient when it comes to a doubt in a rabbinic law. We are stringent in a biblical law, and so on and so forth. So as long as we make a clear distinction, I haven't added. So that's I think an important view. There's an entire literature discussing this. Maharal discusses it, and others. But that's basically the idea. And also, I think one more point I have to make, which is made by another Rebbe of mine, Rav Shlomo Fisher, alav shalom, who says there's a very powerful idea in Jewish law which dates back to Sinai, and it's in the Torah itself, which is the idea of Kabbalat HaKahal, the acceptance by the community. The Jewish people, we always talk about Kabbalat HaTorah. We accepted the Torah. We said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do it and we'll listen. Right? And that formed the basis of our Judaism. He says that idea that the Jewish people accept something upon themselves and that becomes sacred and obligatory, he said, didn't stop with Sinai. It included the acceptance of the Mishnah. It included the acceptance of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. And if the Jewish people as a whole for thousands of years have accepted something, that has a certain sanctity to it. And even it's not adding to the Torah to say the Jews accepted upon themselves that when a Jewish man learns Torah, says a blessing, right, etc., wears a head covering, and of course it became even extended to wearing a head covering all the time. That's not adding to the Torah. That was something which the Jews accepted upon themselves as a sacred practice, which we're allowed to do, and which does obligate us. And if I can have we have time for one more point. I saw in a article by an Israeli journalist, secular journalist, years ago. He said he made the following argument. He says, there's a game called chess, which we think was invented in Persia thousands of years ago, Shachmat. It's a recognizable historical entity. Chess has been played for a long, long time. I would like to join the Chess Federation. I'm a good chess player, but I would like to, I have different rules. I've invented some new rules. In my home, chess is a contact sport. Involves a little combat. Case of my children, that was true, right? So the International Chess Federation will say, you know what? It's all very nice. You can start your own federation. You can start your own game. You can call it, Becher chess, right, etc. That's all very nice, but chess is a recognized historical entity. It's been around for thousands of years, with rules and with an accepted way in which it's played. Right? Goodbye. We're not interested. Right? The same is true. This Israeli journalist says, same is true of Judaism. You want to start something new and say, oh, we have different rules. Shabbos for us is Sunday or Friday, or Shabbat is a day for golf, etc., etc. Yom Kippur, fasting is optional, and lobster is fine the rest of the year. That's etc. Right? You can do what you want, and you can call it something else. But he says there's a historically recognized entity called Judaism that you could recognize. You go to Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey, Poland, Afghanistan, Russia, Germany, and Jews, traditional Jews from all these countries would recognize kosher, would recognize Shabbat, would recognize Yom Kippur. They may be confused by the tunes and the pronunciation and the cuisine, but there's a recognizable historical entity here. So you can want to create your own thing. You want to call it Becherology, the new religion. Sababa, go ahead. Right. But not Judaism. That's what this Israeli journal, and I thought that was a very good insight. Right. And he was writing it regarding actually reform, the reform movement when it was first making inroads in Israel. He was secular. He says, but the Shabbat I don't keep. I know what it is. The synagogue I don't go to. I know exactly what it should be. Right? It's a famous idea in Israel. Right. And I think that's a little bit also because of the oral tradition. It's a living Torah that has pulsed in the lifetime of the Jewish people throughout history. And that's a little bit of an introduction. Obviously, there's a lot more to be said. As Hillel said, the rest is commentary. Go and learn.
So, Rabbi Mordechai Becher, I think we really just peeled the cover off of this topic. I think we're definitely going to have to do another show on this because this topic is really deep. Listeners, there's something we just mentioned called Daf Yomi. There's 2,711 pages of the Talmud, and it takes 7 years and 5 months to complete. Today, and every day of the year, over 100,000 people get together and study this, probably way more than that. And this is a global Jewish thing. So if you want to learn more about how this law goes, the start would be to go through the 7.5 year cycle. That would be something easy that a person could do. And by the time you're done, I'm confident that a lot of these questions will be done. So maybe you could lead us out with a bracha.
Just a blessing that the Torah should be inscribed on the hearts and the minds of the entire Jewish people, and we should all see it, feel it, hear it, and be inspired by it. I don't know if I would say it was that Daf Yomi is easy, but nevertheless, it might be a good start. Could I give a plug?
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I have a lot of classes about this and other subjects on Torah Anytime, and also on YU Torah. They're all free. You can download, watch, etc. Also, my good friend Rabbi Yehoshua Karsh and I discuss a lot of these in much greater length in our podcast. Two rabbis in a podcast. Not very imaginative name, but accurate. So check those out. And I want to thank Rabbi Sokol for inviting me, and wonderful to be here.
If you guys haven't seen Rabbi Becher's podcast, Two Rabbis on a Podcast, there's so much information over there. Please check it out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.